Hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the third screencast of this class where we're talking about the end of the Upper Paleolithic and the peopling of the Americas. So remember that on Wednesday we talked about that transition from Homo erectus to archaic humans and finally modern humans. And now what we're going to do is talk about the last stage of modern human history. We'll talk about the peopling of the Americas. So at this point we're talking about the Upper Paleolithic, about 35,000 to 20,000 years ago. So at this point in time, really, there's only one hominin left, and those are fully anatomically modern humans. They're no longer Neanderthals. They're just humans, and they've populated only the Old World, only Europe, Asia, and Africa, and down into Southeast Asia. By this time, we do have them also in Australia. However, by about 35,000 to 20,000 years ago, we had modern humans in what is today the coldest, harshest environments of Eastern Asia up into Siberia that you see here. It's around 36,000 to 15,000 years ago. Sometimes what we'll do is instead of saying 1,000 years ago, we'll use KYA, so that means thousands years ago. The world was colder, there were giant ice sheets, and as ice sheets increased, this took water out of the oceans and caused a retreat of the oceans. In this part of the Bering Sea, it revealed a land bridge between what is today Siberia and our state of Alaska. So this landmass that it exposed is called Beringia, and it formed a land bridge between what's today the Russian Far East and Alaska. So there were ancient peoples, what we call proto-Amerinds in this area, sparsely occupied. However, by about 16,000 years ago, the ice sheets that we have here began to retreat, creating these corridors into North America. So slowly, and over a long period of time, people began to expand from Asia into North America across this land bridge. And as they crossed into, they began to expand into the interior of North America through these corridors by the retreating ice sheets. So when we talk about these people, they're sometimes referred to as Amerinds, sometimes referred to as Paleo-Indians, or oftentimes referred to as Clovis people or the Clovis culture. We kind of use those terms interchangeably. But they were the first people, or what we once thought of as the first people to come into the Americas. So Paleo-Indians are associated with these Clovis points that you see here. These are large, very ornate examples of Clovis points. They're oftentimes much smaller. So what you can see is that they're very sophisticated. They're made by pressure flaking, take a core, and slowly and deliberately remove flakes from it using a pressure technique, using some sort of bone or some sort of antler. What you can also see in these Clovis points is that they're fluted. So they have on either side, they have these depressions in them, and they also have this notch at the bottom. So we know that this is clear evidence that they were hafted onto some sort of shafts and attached to them, probably used as spear points. Very, very sophisticated. And they were undoubtedly used for hunting, as we'll talk about in a second. So these Clovis points in the Clovis culture date to about 11,000 to 11,500 years ago. So how do we know this? Well, we find them in association with charcoal from the fires that they created. So with charcoal, we're able to date those using radiocarbon dating to 11,000 to about 11,500 years ago. So remember that this temporal period, 11,000, 12,000 years ago, is beyond what we can use for dendrochronology in North America, which only goes to about 8,000 years ago. Also, paleo peoples, they did not build houses, they did not have wood, so we don't have the kinds of beams that we have for dendrochronological dating. So they're called Clovis people, Clovis sites, or the Clovis culture because of these Clovis points that you see here and that we described earlier. The first sites were discovered in the 1930s in Clovis, New Mexico, so that's where they get their name from. This is actually the Laner Mammoth Kill site in Arizona. So even though we had found points, it is a bit difficult to infer from those points what they were associated with in their time period and what they were used for. However, at the Laner site, which was excavated, I believe, in the 1950s, they actually found this Clovis point clearly in situ with this bison mandible here and also this mammoth bone down here. You can imagine that it's actually embedded with them. So this provided really good evidence that we would find Clovis points in association with extinct megafauna. This revealed also uncontrovertible evidence that they were big game hunters, so they're hunting mammoths, mastodons, prehistoric horses, and also possibly saber-toothed cats in the region. And so they're found in association with extinct megafauna, showing that they dated back to the Pleistocene. So this is biostratigraphic dating, finding these points, these human points, projectiles, in association with extinct megafauna, and this confirmed the relative age of Clovis, that it dated toward the end of the Pleistocene. And it also showed definitive proof that we have these large game hunters. And this explains possibly how they came over from Asia, that they were following megafauna, slowly expanding their territory as the herds retreated before them. So we find scattered Clovis sites throughout North America, and we also find what we call today pre-Clovis sites that we'll talk in a second. So this became the dominant model for the people in the Americas, that there was a Clovis first model that stated that the Clovis culture was the first group to enter the Americas. So as a consequence of this, the general idea is that most of the contemporary indigenous peoples of the Americas are descendants of these original Clovis. So there was a migration, possibly several migrations of Clovis-type people into the Americas, from which contemporary Indian groups are descended. There's also a controversy associated with Clovis culture, that they were definitely big game hunters, and they were also implicated in the Pleistocene extinction of large megafauna like mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and mastodons. So this is early on kind of evidence that where humans go, they also destroy, and that we find this extinction dated to around this time period. However, there's also evidence that this is the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. So it was indeed these big game hunters, probably in conjunction with also climate change, that caused this large extinction. So it's not people alone, but as you can see, our ability to destroy our environment goes way back to about 12,000 years ago. So for the longest time, this remained as a barrier for the peopling of the Americas. The first people here were the Clovis people, and they came about 11,200 years ago. However, in the 1990s, this began to be tested as they found new evidence. So actually, one of the sites that we have for pre-Clovis cultures is actually not too far away. There are a couple in Virginia, and there's also a famous one called the Topper site in South Carolina. So in the Topper site in South Carolina, they found Clovis points. However, as they began to find some of the evidence of some pre-Clovis sites in North America and also South America around 1995 and 1997, archaeologists working at the Topper site decided that what they would do is that they would test this pre-Clovis hypothesis by actually digging underneath the Clovis strata that they already had. So in some of these other areas, they had found pre-Clovis material that dated before Clovis and contained material that was not recognizable as Clovis, but they had found it largely incidentally. So here at the Topper site, we had a stratum dated to Clovis, and the general idea is that that's just where you stop digging, because that was Clovis. There's nothing beyond Clovis. There's no reason to dig underneath it. However, the archaeologists were excited about the possibility of finding pre-Clovis material, so they continued to dig below their Clovis stratum that they had. Lo and behold, the archaeologists revealed what we see here, these pre-Clovis stone tools, and they were able to date them using radiocarbon dating to 12,000 to 16,000 years ago. So this is really quite stunning. Again, assembled evidence that there were actually pre-Clovis peoples in the Americas, and this raises other questions, such as were the Clovis peoples descendants of these pre-Clovis peoples, or were there multiple migrations into the Americas, these pre-Clovis people being one of them? But what this did is it's pushed back the clock by 1,000 to 4,000 years for the occupation of the Americas. So now there's evidence that we have pre-Clovis peoples in the Americas, particularly North America. However, what sparked a lot of this were actually findings in around 1997 by Tom Dillahay, who was there at that time at the University of Kentucky and is now at Vanderbilt University with the Monteverde site. So the Monteverde site is in South America. It's on the coast of Chile, and it suggested it's found in this bog, and it suggested a pre-Clovis occupation of South America. So Monteverde is a bog with really good preservation of tent stakes, tools, and cord. So because it was in this anaerobic environment, that as the bog covered up this area, it was able to cover up these tools and preserve them really well. It protected them from oxygen. So radiocarbon dates from the bone and charcoal give an age of at least 14,800 years ago, and there's even evidence of like charcoal stains and other material, very crude stone tools below these strata that deliver a date of possibly even 33,000 years ago. Although that date of 33,000 years ago is very controversial and is not generally accepted by the scientific community. But this brings up an interesting question. Well, how on earth could people have come from Beringia over the Bering Land Bridge 16,000 years, 14,800 years ago, before those corridors were even open? And how could they get there so quickly when other dates are so much younger? So one of the possibilities is that humans could have migrated from Asia by boats along the coast. So even though this too is controversial, or they could have traveled over the ice, so even though this too is controversial, it remains indeed possible. And so basically this evidence from Monteverde and also from other sites suggests that there were peoples in the Americas before Clovis. So the Clovis first model has been tested and found to be by and large unfounded. That peoples could have been in the Americas and expanded into the Americas at least 14,800 years ago, or about 15,000 years ago. So these are some of the important sites. I think it's nice to know that some of them are actually close to home, not too far away in South Carolina, that have become really important for understanding the peopling of the Americas. So next week we're going to start learning about archaeology. So I'd like you to begin reading Chapter 6, pages 153 to 165. And what I want you to do is I want you to be prepared to talk about how archaeology differs from paleoanthropology. What are some of the things that archaeologists study that paleoanthropologists don't? But also, in what ways are they similar? What I'll do is I'll also on Monday bring in some stone tools so you can see what these Clovis points and some of these other artifacts look like. And we'll also do some review for the midterm.